purpose of this video is to talk about the Krebs cycle and discuss how it fits into the process of respiration. If we go back to the same diagram that we used previously, the Krebs cycle is the second step of the process. The thing that you have to remember from before is that it's getting certain things from the process of glycolysis. Now we'll review this very quickly, but the main thing that you need to remember is the pyruvic acid. That's what's moving from glycolysis onto the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle basically runs off of the carbons that are found in that pyruvic acid. One of the very important things to understand about this chapter is how the different stages are connected to one another. So that's really the key here, that's going from what we were talking about in the previous video on glycolysis onto the one on the Krebs cycle. So we'll get this one out of the way. We'll very briefly pull up the glycolysis diagram. Remember, this one's showing you that you get two pyruvic acids at the end. It's very important to remember that there are two of them. That's one of the things that we'll focus on today when we're looking at the diagram for the Krebs cycle, is that there are some consequences of there being two pyruvic acids that are created during the process of glycolysis. So if we take a look at the Krebs cycle for a moment, this should look somewhat familiar to you. It's similar in some ways to what we were seeing with the Calvin cycle. The first thing to look at is pyruvic acid. If you notice, pyruvic acid comes in up at the top of this process. And just to walk you through one time with what happens, that pyruvic acid gets a carbon removed from it. One of the things that you have to remember about what's going on in this chapter is that every time a bond is broken, energy gets released. So there's a bond that's holding that carbon onto pyruvic acid. What happens when that bond is broken is that energy is released, and that energy is used to energize NAD+ into NADH. Now, since that carbon's broken off, it ends up binding with oxygen, and it's released in the form of carbon dioxide. The important thing to remember here is this process requires oxygen. If you remember the formula for respiration, on the left-hand side we have oxygen and glucose. This is where that oxygen's coming into play. The oxygen's bonding with that carbon in order for you to release it as a waste product. What this means, and this is very important, is that the Krebs cycle does not work without oxygen. So the next part of this process leaves us with two carbon molecules. These are the two carbons that are left over from pyruvic acid when the one carbon was removed from them. These two carbons get pushed down into the actual Krebs cycle. This is the cycle portion of it. I always describe this next step as like bad merging. I know many of you are learning to drive at this point, or at least close to learning to drive. If we look at this as like this is the highway going around in a loop. So you can see we have a 4-carbon compound coming up the highway. There's now a 2-carbon compound that's sort of merging onto the highway. And I want you to think of these two things as sort of colliding together. It's like bad merging. We get a 4-carbon compound coming up, colliding with a 2-carbon compound, and that's what gives us our 6-carbon citric acid. So it's these 4 plus these 2. They merge right here to give us our 6 carbons. Now, as we work our way around the cycle, even though this looks complicated, the same thing is pretty much happening over and over and over again. The first thing to talk about is, again, a carbon is removed. As that carbon's removed, it bonds with the oxygen to form carbon dioxide, and it's released as a waste product. Again, I said to think of it as every time a bond is broken, that energy gets released. So there's energy holding that carbon on there. Technically, it's an electron. We talked about the electrons like glue this chapter. You think of them as glue that holds molecules together. So as that energy is released, that electron's released, that's what goes on to change NAD+ into NADH here. So now we're left with a 5-carbon compound because one of our carbons left on that carbon dioxide. Same thing happens again. A carbon is removed. That releases energy. That energy is used to energize NAD+ into NADH and an ADP into an ATP. The way I suggest thinking about this is as we move through the Krebs cycle, this molecule becomes less and less stable. The less stable it is, the more energy that can be removed from it at each step. So here we get one energy carrier. In the next step, we get 2 energy carriers. And then in the next step here, going from our 4-carbon compound back up to it merging down and becoming citric acid again, we again get 2 energy carriers. The 4-carbon compound is so unstable that it's easy to get energy from that without even removing a carbon. So if you think of this as like as it goes through the cycle, it becomes less and less stable. That's why we get more energy from it as we go. The main thing that you really need to understand about this process is how many of each product we get. I realize looking at it now it can become kind of overwhelming, but once we break it down into it creating the same products, because it's really doing the same things over and over and over again. For example, like NADH is made in 4 different places. Right? It's made up at the top, over here, down on the side, and then up here again. So we're going to take a second to go through and look at that. For starters, I guess we'll begin with NADH since I kind of already gave that one away. There's 4 of them altogether. So we'll circle those 4. That's something good to sort of have written down here. So NADH, there's 4. Now I'll give you a second to look at the diagram and see if you can find all of the carbons, or all the carbon dioxides rather, that are made here. Do you have it? Well, altogether there's 3. We'll see if you found them. We've got 1 here, 1 there, and 1 there. So CO2s, we have 3 altogether. The next thing for you to look for is the number of ATPs that are made. Got it? It's actually just 1. It's 1 ATP down there at the bottom. So ATP equals 1. And then the last one you have to find is called FADH2. That's right. There's only 1 FADH2 as well. So the key with this is I think that kind of simplifies things. It breaks things down a little bit in that this process is really just the same kind of thing being produced over and over and over again as we work our way through this process. It's very important for you to know these totals and where each of these things go. Before we get too caught up in this, remember back to the process of glycolysis. How many pyruvic acids did we get from glycolysis? If you remember, we got 2 of them. What that means is that each of those pyruvic acids go through this entire cycle. So all of these numbers technically get doubled. So really, instead of 4 NADH, we actually end up with 8 because the process happens 2 times. So same kind of thing with the carbon dioxide, really get 6. You get 3 for each pyruvic acid that goes through. So for FADH2, we really get 2 of those, and then for ATP, same number. We still technically are getting 2 of those molecules because we get 1 ATP from the first pyruvic acid, we get the second ATP from the second pyruvic acid going through there. The last thing to talk about is where each of these things are going. The NADH is going on to the electron transport chain, moves on to ETC because it's an electron carrier. CO2 is released as a waste product. ATP is finished. It's a finished product. It's released into the cell for use. And FADH2 also moves on to the electron transport chain. I'll write all those things down for you on the final page, on the summary page, if you didn't catch them right away as we were going through it. But I really think the number one thing to take away from this process is that every time a bond is broken, energy gets released, and then the idea that it's really the same couple steps that are happening over and over and over again. So just to summarize this one quickly, because I'm trying to keep this under 10 minutes for you guys, the first thing to remember is that this is the second step of our process of respiration. The next thing is that it's powered by pyruvic acid. Remember, technically there's 2 of them. You also have to know the total number of products. So for NADH, we get a total number of 8, and those go to the electron transport chain because they're electron carriers. So it sort of makes logical sense. For FADH2, our total number there, if you remember, is 2, and those also go on to the electron transport chain. Then there's CO2 that's produced. the total number there was 6, because we get 3 from each pyruvic acid. Those are released as waste products. And then the last one is the ATP. The total number there is 2. And those are released to the cell. They're ready to be used for energy. So the final point for this one, I'll sort of sneak it in over on the side. I'm going to write this one kind of big because it's important. This step does not work without oxygen. This is very, very important. We're going to talk about a whole process later on in the chapter called fermentation, and that's what happens when you don't have oxygen present, because the Krebs cycle will not run. And if the Krebs cycle is not running and all of these products it's making are going to the electron transport chain, that means ETC does not work either if there isn't any oxygen being produced, or if there isn't enough oxygen in the cell. So these are the main points that you have to know in order to understand the process of the Krebs cycle. Please make sure you answer the questions when you're finished with the video. Thank you for watching.